short introduction of Professor Vishnupriya Dutt. She is a professor in School of Arts and Aesthetics, our wonderful department in the JNU. And her work over the years have been around larger questions of political theatre, feminist theatre, theatre historiography in the Indian context, as well as larger relations of exchange, etc., and especially German context, because she's not just going to speak about it, she's also been actually one of the important people in part of certain kind of relations and periods that we are looking at, trained as an actress from the GDR. So I give over to ma'am to discuss about issues about post-independence theatre and kind of political theatre from in relation to Germany.
Thank you, Amit. And it's wonderful to be sharing this space with you, Peter. Amit asked me to sort of take and to sort of make it viable to be 1 hour long only. I was sort of thinking that, when we do look at the impact of either the GDR or the Federal Republic of Germany's impact on Indian theatre, there's always a tendency, to simplify the whole sort of history. So either we look at it as, sort of the Cold War influence, so there's GDR coming with, their sort of material, their sort of setting up certain institutions, helping certain theatres to sort of do Brecht in their own way. And like they set up something called the Brecht Society of India. And then there was the FRG who comes with the Goethe Institutes, who have, different sort of funding systems to come and help, these sort of post-colonial nations to sort of do a lot of German theatre. And the other way has always been, that to sort of say that we were so dependent on the colonial texts and canons, particularly Shakespeare, that when Brecht comes, it's a very easy sort of alternative to the Anglo-American paradigm, to the sort of English theatre, and we sort of adapted it and we used it. Though both of them are true to a certain extent, but actually it was far more complex. And I think in that complexity lies the idea of, some sort of politics, political forces at play, and what was to become the political theatre in India, its relationship with Brecht. And, these are sort of prints which used to come from the GDR to India. So they were very, mnemonic of that time of, the Berlin Ensemble setting up, as Peter was saying, that Brecht goes to Eastern Germany. He sort of works a bit in the Deutsche Theater, and then he's given a theater of his own, which becomes very iconic for not only the German Democratic Republic, but a lot of the post-colonial nations. And a lot of people are invited to go and visit them, to see the theatre. And I thought I'll use a, sort of example of a cultural institution, which is a National School of Drama. And the National School of Drama, if you see post-independent, is probably the only institution which gets the name of drama, right? Others are Sangeet Natak Academy, Lalit Kala Academy, but theatre is sort of marginalized within the larger, sort of vision of the new nation and the new nation sort of cultural policies. And where it exists is a drama institute where a new generation of actors are going to be trained. They're going to be the new citizen artists of a new nation. And of course, this is Utpal Dutt, and this is, the beginning of a new political theatre in post-independent India. Alkazi visits the Berlin Ensemble, but he also visits a lot of the, theatres in the Federal Republic of Germany, Western Berlin. Utpal Dutt is invited to Eastern Berlin, to the GDR. He travels a lot. He's shown the theatre. Quite excited about what they were seeing. They meet Helene Weigel in their first trip. So this is, a sort of a personal interaction, a sort of dialogue across certain ideological underpinnings, and sort of a sort of solidarity which comes within a more sort of theatre interaction. I used both of them because they were quite important people in the founding of the post-colonial Indian theatre. This is actually a quote from Shamik Bandyopadhyay, which, he writes this sort of about the post-colonial Indian theatre, and he says they're the very two key figures, Al-Qazi and Dutt, and they start with, their trajectories beginning with Shakespeare in English, catering to a small elite audience in the big cities, moving to European classics and contemporary plays, Al-Qazi choosing the Greeks and Chekhov, Dutt, Shaw and Odette, before plunging into language theatre. Temperamentally and ideologically quite different, both of them explored the potential of post-colonial Indian theatre in a manner that remains unemulated. And both of them, were really some of the first theatre practitioners in India who were really interested in Brecht. Al-Qazi used to have this, very interesting slideshow, which he used to show to people who would come to Delhi on these official conferences, seminars. I'm sure he showed them to his students, giving a very detailed sort of, who is Brecht, what does he do, what is theatre like, how Brecht's theatre is, very popular in both the East and the West. So a very, important show, and, he was a very theatrical, very performative person. So a lot of people actually talk about it, and one of them is actually Joan Littlewood, who comes for the East and West conference, and she says she meets this Indian, director of the National School of Drama, at that time it was called the Asian Theatre Institute, who gives her this whole history about Brecht, which she herself didn't know till then. So it's, how the post-colonial nation was looking at Brecht. And also, Utpal Dutt is one of the first people who translated Brecht into Bengali, into any Indian language. And, he wrote a lot on Brecht's theory, trying to apply it to actors in Bengal, people he worked with, a sort of a very discursive, understanding of Brecht and how it can be applied to post-colonial India. But surprisingly, neither of them ever did any Brecht production, despite, the entire range of plays they directed, the canons, particularly Shakespeare, Odette, Chekhov, everything. They never really did a full Brecht production. And I think one of the reasons, and they've talked about it in many ways, is that they knew that, importing Brecht may lead to an abstraction of Brecht's techniques from their own historical and material conditions. That somehow Brecht may not be appropriate for, the Indian theatre scene, because, that whole rationalization, the way he broke the scene, the Indian audience was not conditioned to this sort of a Brechtian method. Similarly, local and historical meanings could not be promiscuously applied to other countries and contexts, particularly post-independent India. The Brechtian strategy of historicizing both Brecht and the Indian post-independent theatre leads to a clarification by juxtaposition. So when they apply Brechtian strategies and method, it sort of helps them to understand Brecht, but also to adapt it to, free adaptation, to strategize how to use it, and not, have just bring Brecht into India. And there was a lot of examples of where Brecht is being reproduced in India exactly the way it's being done in, Berlin Ensemble. They refrain themselves from it. They restrain themselves from it. So made plays according to the material conditions of local contexts, but illuminated through reference to the Brecht legacy. So, and Brecht's oeuvre too sometimes appear differently in light of the unique inflection and modifications of a different time and place. So they worked a lot with Brecht, engaged with Brecht, but in context of their own theatre. Al-Qazi, for example, what he, sort of really tried to do is introduce these two important, German practitioners to come and teach in the National School of Drama. The first was Karl Weber. He was a very important person in the Berlin Ensemble. After Brecht died in 1956, he became the artistic director of the Berlin Ensemble. So he comes to the National School of Drama and does a production of Caucasian Chalk Circle. And of course, a much more prolonged engagement for over 20 years was Fritz Benowitz. And he came regularly to the National School of Drama and sort of directed first production was Three Penny Opera in 1968 and then 1970, and then a series of Brecht, like Good Women of Szechuan. He did a lot of Shakespeare, including Othello, worked in Bhopal, worked in Ninasam, a lot of the institutions, and a lot with students who had learned from him, graduated from NSD, and had moved to these institutions. So he was a long-term collaborator, in the National School of Drama, and many of them speak about it, and I'll just, sort of highlight what some of them say about the collaboration with Benowitz. And then later, when they actually were sort of practicing theatre and were heading these institutions, he continued to work with them. I'm using, one sort of paper seminar presentation by somebody who was part of some of the Benowitz productions and had worked with him, is Anuradha Kapoor. So this is a paper she had written, she never published it, called The Radical Classroom, Historical Trajectories, a Political Conjuncture, and an Allegory of Erasure. And she talks about, that this was a very important conjuncture when Benowitz enters the National School of Drama and becomes an important part of the new actor training methods and pedagogy which was sort of coming into the country. She starts this presentation with, that this is a time when India has a sort of very international vision. She talks about the non-alignment movement. Anuradha has worked with it. She calls it the Bandung humanism. She brings in, quite interestingly, this internationalism with a very local sort of thing, and she relates it to these experiments with folk theatre. And she says, this is the moment when the idea of the folk was not defined. It was not as yet categorized into strict definitions. And she says it's very hard to, sort of say what was the folk defined at that point, because the ground is uneven between these forms. And it is perhaps counterproductive as well to the processual nature of the grammars that are made and remade at historical junctures. But he says, this is a time when, while India was looking at this sort of internationalism through Bandung, through Nam, they were also sort of getting very interested in the folk forms of the people, whether, the people was still very important to sort of think of the nation. And she makes this quite interesting connection to how Raymond Williams, in his keywords, looked to the idea of the folk as something which is backdating. So it's a process of historicization. So she says, all these factors sort of define a conjuncture. And as we were discussing in class that day, that, conjuncture is a very important moment where social forces are sort of changing, coming together. The big transition has happened, from a post-colonial nation which is setting up its institutions. We always think of it as very homogeneous within the nation-state framework, maybe a secular nation, so why folk? But she says, no, there were a lot of these different, sort of social forces, cultural forces at play. And also, like all conjuncture, as Antonio Gramsci says, lot of determinants. It's over-determined. So she says a lot of these factors were coming. Lotus, as you know, is this very important journal which sort of captures the spirit of internationalism, Bandung, art, culture. So this is, a poster and one photograph from Fritz Benewitz's first production in the National School of Drama. Look at the actors who are here. Just see them, because we'll come back to some of them who were students at that time, who are training under him. Amal Alana is actually at that point in the GDR. Amal Alana is Ibrahim Al-Qazi's daughter, who's training in the theatre in GDR, when this invitation comes as a cultural exchange program between India and Germany, and Benewitz is invited. So Benewitz just asks her, you're Indian, you know Hindi. Do you think you can come with me in your summer holidays and be my assistant? So she says, yeah, but who invited you? A man called Ibrahim Al-Qazi. So she says, yeah, I would love to. So she comes and she's the assistant of this production. So, and she sort of helps him with it. It's very interesting, because when we talk about genealogies, particularly institutional genealogy, it's so automatically assumed, right, that it's these big individuals, Al-Qazi, B.V. Karan, then comes, so many of those directors and actors who come out of National School of Drama. They're all trained by them. B.V. Karan teaches them folk, Al-Qazi teaches them the method and things. But what I'm trying to say, think that, such linear genealogies don't work. It's like very complicated in many ways, because Al-Qazi is steeped in the Radha method. Radha has a particular acting method which is appropriate for a colonial theatre system. Doing Shakespeare, how do you perform Shakespeare? And they spend years just teaching you how to speak the correct pronunciation for Shakespeare, how to perform Shakespeare, soliloquies and everything. Radha has some sort of Stanislavski method, but unlike the Soviet Union, which you will hear from Indu tomorrow with Anamika Haksar, it's not the central methodology. It's just something, if you're doing Chekhov or some of these realistic plays, you may need it, but Shakespeare acting method is different. And this is what Al-Qazi brought very systematically and transformed into the acting curriculum. And now with Benewitz, we see, a very different method being introduced, which I'm saying has a lot of the Brechtian strategies, Brechtian techniques, training methods which are coming in. And again, with Peter's talk, Anuradha says that if we see that, this is the point where there was a lot of interest in the folk, what was the interest? It was the chorus. It was, the sort of, the choreography which comes from the sort of, choric intervention, the third person narrative. This is how that interest in folk had influenced theatre. Movement, music, song and percussion. And these are something which, the actor training methods, these cultural institutions were sort of dialoguing with, when the state was sort of intervening and trying to create a lot of interest in the folk theatre. So if you again, look at Anuradha's sort of where she's seeing Benewitz's or Carl Weber, she doesn't mention Carl Weber because she said she never interacted with him, but it would be similar, the methods which were impacting the drama school education. First, she says, is the dramaturgy. Benewitz or Carl Weber didn't know a word of Hindi or any Indian languages. But they would get some, it would be translated, it would be in Hindi. So what he would do is really break up everything into a word, a sentence, and try to find, the resonance between the German word and the Indian word to see if it resonates. And sort of within the word, as Anuradha tells us, he tries to bring action in. And she makes a very interesting reference that when they were doing Othello and Atul Tiwari was doing the translation, he used the word ajab. And Benowitz didn't like it. She says, give me a pulling of the words. So he said, Ajib? Said, yeah, strange, Ajib, that sort of sound resonances he would be playing with. But he would really break down the words, the dialogues, the scenes to its skeletal sort of, the key words almost, and then start improvisation. So what they were doing in many ways, and we'll come to that later, is almost deconstructing Brecht's text. And then Shakespeare, if you look at Othello, and you know what Shakespeare meant to the colonial theatre, right? It's the canon. So how do you break down the words and they just become impulses of certain scenes, and then from there to again start building it up? And again, he would tell them, historicize in the Brechtian method, but don't, sort of look at it in the past. What does the history do for the present? Constantly making those connections and doing a lot of work on dramaturgy, breaking down the text and then rebuilding the text. In acting and performance text, choreography. And his choreography is very different from Al-Qazi's sort of choreography, which has that vertical axis. You've seen pictures of Tughlaq, you've seen pictures of Al-Qazi plays. It's so vertical. You can almost see the hierarchies of, the emperor, the sultan, and how they're sort of breaking down. This is exactly the opposite. And, this sort of choreography where it's more horizontal, coming together, actors all over the place, and no actor. And Al-Qazi, that was a big thing, right? He created some star actors over the others. So again, you hear of Manohar Singh, you hear of, Om Puri, you hear of Nasiruddin Shah, big actors. But here it was a sort of more choreographical, choral. Everybody has a role to play. They're building on these scenes together. Gesture, and Anuradha says that, how a gesture can be psychological, how it can also be class and other identities. And he would spend long hours of rehearsal analyzing that gesture, that action. He provoked the actors to engineer gesture, and so that an abstract classification of how social structure model bodies. I've worked with Benowitz. I've seen him working in Weimar theater also. When he really goes up to the actor, in a way it can be quite intimidating, and how to do the gesture, and how do you use the word, how do you create the gesture, through his body. He almost gets across a body to body sort of gestural dialogue as a director. Scenography, and here I think he played a very important role, because we know how this whole materiality comes into the theatre. And even Al-Qazi's, sort of the scenography, the excesses of scenography, excesses of materiality, it comes after this 67, 68 sort of a phase. So I'm not saying that, Benowitz influenced Al-Qazi, but it became a method. And later the feminists, who will all say that, we learned from Al-Qazi and Karan, all talks about how they improvised with objects, how they sort of, removed their own self and individuation through different objects and used the object to sort of create a different sort of subjectification. And that this was a process which we will see very, very apparently in the feminists, right? When they don't want to create this male protagonist versus the female protagonist. You have the male star, then you have the female star. Like, if you have Manohar Singh, you have Uttara Bhaukar. Feminists will not do that later, the feminist theatre directors. And they will go into this sort of, materiality, how that materiality tells you a story of inequality. It's a very interesting politics, and again, how it talks about, impoverishment, how it talks about, the uneven distribution of wealth, in India. And for the woman, it's always very important that amidst all these intersections of identities, the women at the intersectionalities are the most marginalized. So the idea of the materials, how they sort of reduce texts to materials, all of you who did that workshop with Anuradha, how she brings, dialogues, texts down to words, then words down to properties which you have to make, and then you start rebuilding the scenes from the objects. And she says, this sort of objects all over this tray, this excessive, sort of materiality on the stage, they learned a lot from Fritz Benowitz. And again, NSD doesn't think much that, audiences are important. They hardly need an audience. They don't need to sell tickets, and they don't need money from an audience, and they never think of it nowadays. But at that time they did, because they were thinking of, who is going to be the audience, how. And Benowitz brings in the whole issue of device, affect, spectatorship, and what did these actions make the spectator do? Does the spectator listen, question, get uncomfortable? What happens in the conflicted courses of the performance? I'll skip some of these. And end of it, because I thought this was relevant for the course, she asked, that is this an interculturalism? There's sort of exchange with the East German director, students of a institution in India. Is it a form of interculturalism? And she says, if it is, what are the options of interculturalism we have? And the first, which she says, and there she would locate Benowitz, is a complex relay, decolonization processes, third world projects, post-colonial consciousness, new forms of sovereign statehood, alternate modernities, and socialist movements that seek solidarities. All this often entails active state support and intervention as much as it does an exchange of ideas and pedagogy between friendly people. She also describes the other sort of interculturalism, like diaspora interculturalism, cultural exchanges of, part of cultural diplomacy. She talks about even interweaving cultures, which is this Erika Fischer-Lichte project. But she says, if I look at, the period where he was here, the 60s and 70s and to early 80s, till the Berlin Wall fell, even then he would come, but that was really the break point. Then he would belong to something which is interculturalism and internationalism as interchangeable. So this is where what she says. So any questions on, this sort of how this pedagogy comes in, how it creates a, an alternative pedagogy at a time when the Al-Qazi and his Rada methods, and that's what most of his, the big directors of his generation were steeped in, the sort of English theatre method. Any questions? Yeah, Nisha.
Ma'am, my question comes in sort of tying this but into your thing. You said at the beginning that it was a...
Amrita can't hear you. Can you speak louder?
Louder? Is this okay? Yeah, sorry. So you said at the beginning that NSD in that sense, because theatre was marginalized and this was one place where sort of institutional negotiations or explorations of theatre as a culture practice happened. Now, seeing that from German theatre and what Professor Marx spoke about, this idea of democratic sort of people masses, dramaturgy, stage techniques, and it came at a time in India when theatre practice sort of was modern proscenium theatre and moving out of traditional regional theatre practices. So when one looks at it in terms of constituting not only the pedagogy but also the epistemology of what will now be theatre in India, how does one sort of understand this secular culture that theatre has, not that comes from region, but that is being created as it is being devised, as the practices are being formalized. Because this is a culture that is also of the post-colonial Indian nation state, where it doesn't have a religious or regional legacy. And there are these scholars from the West, these sort of practitioners from the West or influenced by the West. And like you said, the current sort of the folk. So there is this very reaction and sort of negotiation happening, but it's a very different culture practice while it is happening in India, being done here. How would you sort of read that into the cultural aspect of intercultural?
I see. My reading would be that initially after independence and the 1956 seminar, there was quite a deal of interest in theatre. I think they expected that a sort of the theatre culture which existed in colonial times, and then particularly the Indian People's Theatre Association, where a lot of the Indian People's Theatre Association stalwarts went into these cultural institutions, that theatre would be an important area to develop because it was already in practice. But by the end of the 50s, and early 60s, I think they were realizing that theatre was becoming very politicized. It was, like Chantal Mouffe would say, very agonistic towards the state. And this happens with, what we were discussing in class that day, that the sort of the left insurgency just after independence and its aftermath in the IPTA and, the 1951-54 IPTA, which was very radical, more radical than we attribute it to. It had workers, theatre, the peasant theatre. I think the state was getting very uncomfortable with that agonism. And then, all these sort of, it's not Indian enough, all that started. And then, have classical dance reconstruction project, which will be more Indian. We know how the folk theatre projects would go along in different ways, in a more anthropologizing ways. It would lose, the sort of people-orientedness, and where the people in Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time and that Apna Utsav and all that would almost become an empty signifier. So I think, they would move away from the theatre because of its growing politicization. And the idea of the secular, I think that was never so much in question, particularly with these cultural institutions. They were secular, if you look at it that way. That is Rustam Barucha's critique, right? That even when they looked at the folk, they secularized it. IPTA secularized the popular performances. So I don't agree with it. I think it is far more complex. They never imposed that secularism. But when a man like Al-Qazi is a director of the National School of Drama, you hardly expect him to, pursue some sort of, upper class Brahmin Hindu identity, because he belongs to none of them. And I think one of the reasons why he comes into conflict with the state and he resigns from the National School of Drama was mainly because of that. I think those were categories we never questioned. But maybe we should have, but that is, I think, one of the problems. So, of course, this is something, is my legacy. So it's a bit awkward for me to talk about it, but I still want to, sort of present it, because I think, Towards a Revolutionary Theatre, which is a semi-autobiographical work, one of the few, sort of writings by Utpal Dutt on theatre in English. He has lots in Bengali, and it starts with problematizing the question of the post-colonial theatre, acting, theatre practice as such, through the question of Brecht, right? He problematizes through this, idea of Brecht. It starts with this play called Kallol, which is, I read it as an important political theatre, maybe the first political theatre in post-independent India, which almost juxtaposes on a political event. Kallol becomes this very important sort of, center for a lot of political debates, controversies. The director is arrested. There's a lot of attacks on Kallol. Volunteers from the Communist Party would come and try to protect the theatre. And again, there would be huge amount of people. It ran for 4 years continuously. Kallol is about the naval mutiny. The aesthetics is from optimistic tragedy and Battleship Potemkin. So it's a sort of the socialist realism in the more sort of the socialist style. He had seen optimistic tragedy by them. And he talks about, that's how he starts revolutionary theatre, that the character, who's one of, his important actors, he betrays the naval mutiny. And of course, the debate was, they said that the naval mutiny was betrayed by the Congress, Vallabhbhai Patel himself, because they felt that if they didn't control it, it could lead to, a more democratic revolution, but a people's democratic revolution rather than the bourgeois democratic revolution which the Congress mainstream politics was pursuing. That was the content of Kallol, and they show that how Congress party betrays the sailors, and they are killed with some minor concessions made. They are, into the streets. They are sort of what the Royal Indian Navy, the sort of court-martial did, the Indian government did the same thing. And the actor who is playing this sailor, the rating, who will betray the naval mutiny, just gets up and says, I can't play this role. I can't identify with this role. I don't want to, be this character. Why are you telling me to perform this character, and get into his skin, become this man, this succeed? I don't want to do it. And this starts off this whole debate by which he starts bringing Brecht into it. And he says that, Brecht offers certain actors' techniques. And he says this, to be an actor in a political theatre is more important than to be steeped in Marxism or Marxist ideology. And he talks about, an actor who's talking about Marx and Engels and Auerbach and who not, but when it comes to Mozart, he thinks it's a German pista. So he's had actors like that, he said, but the actor of a political theatre has different techniques. He should, in a way, be connected to the larger political movement, and there'll be a sort of a porous relationship between the political theatre and the larger political movement, and the actor may participate in both, but because he's an actor and he's performing these roles, it is very important for him to be in the political movement to actually get over a sort of sense of alienation which is a result of the colonial conditioning. So the colonial conditioning and, theatre in the colonial times is very elite, and he himself comes from the English theatre, as you saw Shabik is saying. Now, how do we do political theatre if we are so cut off from the people, if we are so alienated from the people? That's why this changed to the Bengali language theatre. And then this idea is that to overcome the alienation, how do we sort of create this sort of communication with the people? And towards a revolutionary theatre, and this Amit actually pointed it out to me so many times, that this is about, a colonial intelligentsia who's suffering the agony of, alienation from the people. And from there he goes into the way that, this contradiction that I'm not, it's not a well-made play with a protagonist who's a hero, and he sort of talks about, the theatre done by the communists. He's actually mentioning the IPTA, where, the hero is like a Captain Marvel. So the worker is, almost like Hamlet, or he's even bigger than that. He's a man of virtue. And he says, then, in this society only you have the perfect man. Then you don't need a social and political change anyway. So how do you create, through the text, through the acting, through the performance, a sort of contradictions? And that's how he goes deeper into Brecht. Skip this. And he translates and adapts very, symbolic. He does Naya Zamana in 1966, which is the Targari Commune. He does an adaptation from Mother Courage, but it's like a literal translation and adaptation. He just places it in with Rajasthan, the long war between the Mughals and the Rajputs. He never thinks Brecht's texts, the dramatic texts, are appropriate for an Indian audience. So he says it will never work. So because they're steeped in Shakespeare, and that's one thing, none of them really give up the colonial canons. They are ready to deconstruct the canons. They're ready to deconstruct Shakespeare, but they don't give it up. And when they locate Brecht, alongside Shakespeare, they find a lot of lacuna. In fact, there's a quite interesting, it's called a debate play. It's about a group in Calcutta, and at the late 80s, they were very common, who sort of copying Melina, Beck, Schechner, trying to be very avant-garde, taking off their clothes, doing drugs, trying to do things on stage. And Brecht walks in and says, what are you doing? So, they say, oh, we are doing theatre. And, well, where the language? Well, oh, theatre language is shit, like Melina and Beck. And he goes into it. And very nonchalant, Shakespeare comes in. And then there's this long debate between Brecht and Shakespeare. And then these actors are acting out, the performances. And again, in this dialogue, you will see that, it's a sort of reinstating Shakespeare from his colonial sort of status, deconstructing him for a post-colonial, a political sort of intervention. And Brecht is found, because of his antagonism towards Shakespeare, at least in his early days, very problematic, and he brings it up. But in two of his plays, one is called Hunting the Sun in Shujya Shikar, he uses the same contradiction and dialectics of Galileo Galilei and the idea of a negative hero. And in Towards the Revolutionary Theatre, he says Brecht found it very difficult to show Galileo not as this great martyr, hero of science, but this man who compromises science. Well, this is very difficult, the idea of the negative hero, and Brecht almost failed. But he uses this thing about science and religion in Shujya Shikar between, he places it in 5th century AD in this Gupta Empire, and shows it as this, this is a more recent version actually, in the reign of Samudragupta, who, as we all know, is this iconic emperor who brought in Hinduism and Hindu cultures and whatnot, the great Guptas and all that. And he shows that Samudragupta is really a tyrant. He builds his empire on slave society. And therefore, he cannot tolerate, the religious research which is happening in the Buddhist monasteries. So there is a Buddhist monk, who are sort of proving that the earth is round, but that's going to, get the empire to collapse, because the empire is built on hierarchies. So Samudragupta is a tyrant. He creates poetry, he builds beautiful sculptures, but he kills. He, makes the monk, he takes out his tongue so that he cannot say that the world is round. But Utpal Dutt shifts the same dialectical contradiction to, to show Samudragupta as this negative character, and the Buddhist monk as the martyr. But it's the same sort of dialectics and the same sort of, problems he problematizes in Galileo Galilei. These are a of the, and then the last scene, where Kalhon, the Buddhist monk, his tongue has been taken away, and Samudragupta is saying, tell everybody that the world is round and we will believe you, but he can't speak, right? Then Samudragupta says, it's no use, you can't fight me. You try to say there is no God, very well, we shall make you a god. You gesture wildly with your arms to say man needs reason, not faith. Very well. We shall fall at your feet and worship you and make you a monument of blind faith against reason. You wanted to hunt the sun, old man. That was rash. This is how the sun is hunted. And you can see why, a contemporary group in Calcutta, you know them, right, has done this production. Because today in India, this idea of the science and religion is a very important question. Another play, this is about, of course, 1857. You can see a very young bee. So it's about the revolt of 1857. And it has, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the court of Delhi, the sepoys in Meerut in revolt, the courtesans fighting, the soldiers fighting. It's a story of Mahabidroh, a very documentation, of it. But there's one very minor storyline throughout the play, and there is this family which has been torn apart. They were weavers. Then, when their fingers were cut off, British colonial cotton trade, the father and the son runs away, the mother is left alone. They both become part of the 1857 revolt, and the mother is lost. And this is a scene, it's exactly a scene from Mother Courage. It's in Bengali, but you will understand it's a very short clip.
একে কোতোয়ালিতে দিয়া
সেই ভালো সেখানে অন্তত খেতে দেবে
পিঠে কড়াও লাগাবে রে প্রস্তাব
আপনি হুজুর চাট আচ্ছা হ্যালো কে খান সাহেব
এ বেটি নিমাজ ব্রিগেডে জিহাদিদের কাছে চোলাই মদ বেচছিল গ্রেফতার হয়েছে
এই আর চলাই আছে না সবটাই নিমাজ ব্রিগেড গিলেছে
খবরদার আমি সামনে দাঁড়িয়ে আছি চোলাই চাইছে ও এই বুড়িয়া ঝোলা খোল ঝোলাই কি
আমার ছেলে কিনা তোর বাপের কিয়া ইংলিশ সঙ্গে লড়াইয়ে তো পড়ি কি মরি করে সব পিকচার দিই আর যত তম্বি শহরে নিরীহ মানুষের উপর না
আরে বলছি ঝোলা খোল বন্দি কুচি করেছে দেখি এ কি এ তো ফাঁসি হওয়া উচিত এসব সিপাহীদের মালপত্র কোর্ট থেকে চুরি করেছিস
যে শালা নেবা রোগী সে দুনিয়াটাকে হোল দেখে চুরি দেখছে চুরি করবো কেন
এসব পেলে কোথায়
লড়াইয়ের ময়দানে মৃতদের গা থেকে কুলে নেয়া
রাত্রিবেলা গিয়ে কুড়ো
ছড়িয়ে পড়ে আছে তো পাহাড়ের নিচে শুধু শুধু পচবে কেন তাই কুড়িয়ে নিয়ে আসি
তোমার ভূতের ভয় নেই ভূত ওনার গা থেকে জামা খুলে এনে বেচো
হ্যাঁ যত বেশি শহীদ হয় তত আমার ব্যবসা ফুলে ওঠে আমি চাই তোরা অনেকে
এই ছোট লোক বুড়ি আমাদের মৃত্যু নিয়ে ব্যবসা বেঁধেছে
তোদের মৃত্যু নিয়ে তো বড় বড় বানিয়েরাও ব্যবসা খুলেছে কই তাদের ছাড়া তো মোরা
On our lives. Well, the big, the Nawabs and the businessmen have also, do business on your lives. Who am I? So again, just bringing in the sort of thing and showing that, this sort of what Marx calls the first war of Indian nationalism, that sort of proto-nationalism of 1857, the colonial sort of, pushback in between them, how the common people are so disillusioned, so alienated, so poor, so impoverished by colonial rule. For them, it doesn't matter who's there, they suffer anyway. It's a Nawab or it's the English colonial. So like that, they sort of brought in. And also, the play I was saying about Shakespeare and Brecht. And there are a lot of these, debates, and they are in the chapter we gave you. there's Brecht's idea that the dramatic theatre is based on feeling and the epic theatre is based on rational. And again, he questions in this chapter, but also, in that debate play. And he said, this was a young Brecht. Maybe he didn't even understand, and that's why he's so cannibalistic about Shakespeare. And he says, what's the difference between Mother Courage and King Lear? Lear also, gives up his children. He's a completely alienated being in his feudal milieu, so it's almost comparable. And in that debate play, they perform both Mother Courage and Lear. Then another point where they say that Brecht says dramatic theatre shows unchangeable man and epic theatre man as both subject and object. Then tragedy is based on bourgeois virtues. It draws its strength from them and will perish along with them. And again, Utpal Dutt is arguing that this is not true. If you see Othello, if you see Macbeth, all these important plays of the negative hero, or even Julius Caesar, as we were discussing, he didn't need to create, Arturo Wees and Galley Gaze and these little criminal protagonists. You could create the big, negative hero and then deconstruct. And he says that, tragedy doesn't die out. And in the end of the debate play, Brecht actually sits and starts adapting Coriolanus. So he accepts, Shakespeare's mastery in a way, and that's very telling about the colonial intelligentsia. And again, to come to the end part of the debate, he says that this contradiction, do I play the role or I stand apart from the role? Then can I keep the audience, with me? Will the audience identify if I hate the man? This sort of how do you create this negative hero on stage? How do you create these contradictions on stage so that people don't become, pulled into the theatrical imagination and lose this power to sort of develop a political thinking, to understand their role and to come in. He says all these, a false truth antithesis, has a third element influencing and acting upon it, which is in turn influences, and that is the audience. It is a complex three-way relationship. The process of falsehood and truth playing against each other arises of the need to reach out to the audience. But the third element, the audience is neither passive nor static nor a mere recipient. It begins to act upon both these elements, and that is a theatrical process. If the audience negates the contradiction between falsehood and truth, we can be sure that the dramatist producer has merely thought of contradiction as a simple two-way opposition, which he's saying that Brecht did to a certain way, create a binary which, may work, may fail. That is a thought of the problem as an internal formal problem of the theatre, even though theoretically he sets out to include the audience as co-author. But there's no such thing as an internal problem of form in theatre. Its basic contradiction is triangular. It always induces the audience. And what he starts with, that you don't represent the role, but you represent it too, otherwise you lose your audience. But you also interpret the role. And one cannot altogether, and there Brecht is important because it offers you the strategy, vis-a-vis Stanislavski. But at the same time, it's also part of this relationship with the audience. One cannot altogether stand at a distance from his part and run a commentary on it, as Brecht expects you to do. Nor can one become another person unless inebriated. There is an interaction between the two, acted upon by the common third factor, the audience, leading to failure most of the time and an explosion of experience occasionally. He gives two interesting examples, and one is the Silver Drake, this very important play farce by the nationalist, Michael Madhusudhan Dutt. It's a sort of a take on Merry Wives of Windsor, this, sort of the zamindar, a Hindu zamindar who prays to the god and Shiva all the time, but is lusting after women, and in this case a peasant Muslim woman. and then all the Muslim and the Hindu peasants come together to teach him a lesson. And Utpal Dutt talks about, that this is a play which they did for years. It was like always a play, a short one-act play. They did it everywhere, hugely popular. He was known to perform the Bhakta Prashad, and he was brilliant. He used to play it with slapstick comedy, and you know what a great comic actor he was. But he says that when we went to the villages, at one village, and he was not getting any laughter, which made him desperate. So, he said, I fumbled over a line. And then he said, I tried to, do more slapstick comedy, more, try to get laughed out, but there was complete silence. And then at a point he realizes that for these peasants, they cannot see a zamindar as somebody they laugh at. He's their oppressor. He's terrifying to them, and they don't want to laugh. And he says, at that moment, I suddenly changed the role I had played for so many years, and I became this oppressive, sort of power-hungry, the landlord, and I was out there to destroy them further, because there was a class enmity which was sort of being So he said, that's how the audience brings it. You can read it, and that's, and our relationship to Fritz Benowitz is he comes to Calcutta in 1988 and does a production of The Mother Courage, which is the Himmat Mai. These are scenes from Himmat Mai. And again, we were discussing yesterday what works as within a training, drama acting training institution often doesn't work when you're working with a certain group which has a certain acting methods, a certain style of political theatre. And there were issues with solidarities, but it wasn't an intercultural, international, humanistic experience. But that's okay, it was a good experience. And now when I read Anuradha Kapoor's essay, I can realize some of this. He would come and how he would try to understand the Bengali word, try to break it up, but we always followed that, we follow the text very carefully. We play with the text, but we don't break it down. So these are some of the questions of, Brecht versus how Brecht could be used within a post-colonial country. Questions? And another example which I can do after break if Amit gives and Peter gives me a bit of time, and that's, the question of genealogies, and the feminist director Amal Alana, who, trains in the GDR, works with Fritz a lot. Then, she's one of the first women directors in Delhi theatre who brings a sort of femininity, and she does this very important landmark production of Mother Courage in one of her earlier works. First King Lear, then Mother Courage. And this actor who I asked you to look at actually performs both Lear and Mother Courage in her productions, and that's, we can discuss it later. Questions? Let me take Kamalika first, then we come, because Anisha asked that, should I ask all the questions or should I refrain and let others ask?
There's an online comment just a point to share. Alana talks about working with Fritz Benowitz and how actors could not understand his grammar and the rehearsals were not going anywhere. At this point, it was folk which became a reference point. In particular, the play Jasma Odhan became a reference point. It was characters like Rangla Nayak which became a way to understand Fritz's grammar. How then folk was in many ways positioned to me more Brechtian in nature, which is problematic.
I think whoever it is has answered her or his own question. See, I don't think Fritz looked at folk as a form like later the theatre of the roots would do. And I don't think Anuradha is saying that he picked up a folk form, either just Maudan or anything. I don't think he even knew about those. But it was that conjunctural moment where a cultural institution was, happy to look towards what is the people's practice, what are the folk forms, and then there would be elements like, embodied practice, choreographic movements, use of, objects, the materiality. And somehow Benewitz's method, coming from the socialist Germany, would have melded with that. There would have been a dialogue. But I don't think, at least in the early stages, Benewitz had no knowledge of Indian folk performances and theatre. And if I remember correctly, we have the Kavita Nagpal archive, and Kavita Nagpal did a lot of reviews of Benewitz's productions with Bhopal. And she was quite critical, because I think he did a Good Woman of Szechuan, right, with folk practices. So did Amal, later some Kali and something. And I think, of course, they were very different. Amal's perception of the folk and Benewitz's perception of the folk would be very different. Amal's also, she's not from that rural milieu where, the folk performance is a day-to-day life. But her understanding would be different, like, a sort of ethnographer who's closer to it, but she would use it as a theatrical strategy. And that's where this Brechtian, alienation, historicization, which Anuradha would say backdating, gestures, they would sort of adapt from it and try to, see how Brecht could be useful in the local context. One small thing which I've always been interested in going back to, Utpal Dutt worked a lot with the Jatra actors. And as you know, the Jatra is built on melodrama, is built on, and that Hunting the Sun was first written for the Jatra, and it failed. Actually, the Jatra audience could not accept Samudragupta as the villain, just like the German audience couldn't accept Galileo Galilei. Or sometimes, we feel empathetic towards Mother Courage. But what I realized, like the Jatra actors, they have that gesture, posture, attitude, melodramatic, but they have very beautiful language skills. But it was always very gimmicky. Now, when he was directing, he sort of restrained those gestures a lot, let them use the beautiful, voice, sound, and Jatra actors can make themselves heard over 10,000 people in the open air. And there were moments, and that's how he wrote the text, and the Jatra actors would use it totally, where that gesture would come out. And because they were not using the gesture to illustrate every line, they became very important, Brechtian gestures, which was psychological, but it also, brought in the sociological, the social political aspect to it. And they were legendary, some of them. I don't want to go into detail, but Jatra has a great actorial tradition, as you know, they're big stars in the countryside. And that's how they were sort of using it, yeah.
My question is just related to this and the examples that you gave. So there is the two examples, one that you spoke of him playing the Zamindar and the mother Himmat Mai that we saw. Now, in terms of the narrative, say someone like Himmat Mai would not be in the history. Sort of this sort of dynamic dialectic that is a consistent priority in performance, and which sometimes comes to space, but like he said in this challenge of playing the Zamindar, it is also at that moment seeing how much of the truth falsehood needs to be expanded. So my question is about this sort of I don't know, like according it a space or a time within performance that allows sustaining that dialectic persistently, like in a constant manner, how does that sort of say, like using a jatra form or even using but not sort of like to create a conflict, how does that uh, calculate what uh, what social, what the word that you use, social culture, like the identities or the that will get presented to create that provocation in the narrative that stays the same. Like the frame of the narrative, not exactly the narrative. I don't know if
Yeah, I think that's really the challenge and the question, right? That you want to open up this dialogue with the audience in a very critical way, because for the political theatre you need the audience, otherwise what is it, if I stand there and do Inqilab Zindabad, it doesn't make any sense, right? So, but you also don't want to be pedagogic or propagandist, right? You don't want it to be something from the top. You want to engage with theatre as a democratic practice in civil society and bring out those debates. And he says these strategies are many and various, and because he used to write the the dramatic text, knowing who his actors are and their capabilities, they are sort of interwoven within it. So this idea of the mother courage and Shobha Sen performing it was already inherent in the text. And then she's supposed to take off from the text and sort of use the strategies of acting, which is not complete immersion, but sort of open up a sort of idea of the alienation. But he's saying that there's no one method. And when Brecht is saying that no, Shakespeare fails, only my method is the correct method for political theatre, that's the argument that no. It depends on the context, it depends on where you're performing, the time and the space. Even from the urban theatre to the rural, it will be different. From different parts of India, it will be different. But the main aim is to create this triadic relationship between the actor, the character, and the audience. And the character is also part of that text and the narration.
Section, but certain kind of building from where Peter kind of left us hanging in a certain sense, which is looking at a production which is called Antigone in Calcutta, 1978-79 production in Calcutta of Antigone, directed by Hans Gunther Heimer. Now, this production is quite interesting. Like Peter said, Heimer has a very, very interesting and very complex sort of trajectory of political theatre, starting working with Piscator, and then doing very famous productions like, and very controversial. Again, a lot of his productions are controversial, and if you have a chance to read the reviews that people are writing about his productions in Germany, then it's you will see how controversial and how kind of disparaging in certain senses, anti. Okay, just a second. Current gaya? Power cut. Just a second. I think power cut. I had seen electricians roaming around. Okay. Okay, so while the projector is coming up, this is audible there, no? This is going there, yeah, okay. Like Heimer had a very interesting, very important kind of space within political theatre, and very controversial, even the productions in Germany. And what we are going to look at here especially is a moment when he's in one of his crises, from movement from one as a head of one theatre group and after a lot of controversy moving to another. In midst of that period, he's actually coming to India and kind of it's its first kind of really strong intervention in India, engagement in India, and will continue to be the only engagement in certain sense, but an engagement that he himself would say is actually quite important for his own journey as a theatre artist, right? So we are going to look at certain problems of looking at a production like Antigone in Calcutta, which as we will see, these are his, some of the visuals from thing is happening. No, സംഭവിക്കുന്നു. Oh, no, it's there. Okay. Okay. Here it is. Okay. Yeah. So what we are going to look at is a production in Calcutta when he's sort of he's moving, like I said, he's moving, but the production is quite important for his own kind of framing of his life journey as an artist. And it is a very short interaction. One could say it is, in a kind of larger sense, more like what would later become residency programs, that you come as an artist, particularly in visual art, an artist or a writer coming to a place, staying there for a month and kind of engaging with a space, etc. This could be kind of, in a sense, Jaime's sort of intervention could be seen in a larger sense of certain kind of a residency kind of work. What is more interesting is that, you know, when we are kind of framing it also like this as a question also, a production like this, and you will see the scale of the production is huge. It is extremely controversial in its time, but looking at Indian theatre historiography, theatre history in India, historiography in India especially, you will see that this is not something that is ever discussed, except Bengalis who would know of that generation, who kind of talk about it in an extremely controversial way. But so it created a lot of press, it created a lot of debates at that point, became a site of really contestation, and yet sort of it's completely absent from any kind of discussions. And that is one kind of really point that one kind of have to engage with when one sees like this. And the second point is that, and very quickly, 78, 79, and by the 80s, you will have a certain kind of discourse of interculturalism, which we look at tomorrow in more closely. You will have the certain kind of really theoretical frameworks about interculturalism, huge productions like Mahabharata becoming very, very iconic in the global discourse of theatre, and yet certain kind of early productions which might be otherwise seen within a lens. If it is done today, you would be, you know, or if it was done at least 10 years later, this would have been called or framed as an intercultural production, people would have framed it like that, etc. That also does not kind of happen. So it's very interesting that even the discourses that we know as interculturalism, as certain kind of frames, are actually very, very kind of emerge at certain points. Whether we call this intercultural or not, that's a different question, and we'll come to that towards the end of my short presentation. But we could see how those are extremely contextual, and maybe we need to really probe on the assumptions and basis and where those discourses are probably emerging and the reasons for emergence of some such kind of discourses. Now, so that's kind of my preface to kind of put up. Now, the reason for it is in certain ways larger politics of Cold War, like Vishnupriya that said about Fritz Benowitz is already working in India. He's from East Germany, and here is Max Muller-Bhaven in 2 years before the production, actually having the kind of celebrating Brecht sort of event around Brecht, lot of lectures, discussion, seminar around Brecht, and a dramaturg, Professor Ecken, who works with Jaime, is part of this sort of discussions in the Brecht seminar in Calcutta. And he's the one who goes back and kind of says there's so much interest and kind of engagement. People are desiring a certain kind of engagement with Brecht, and that is what we need to give them. And he would say something very, very interesting, which would kind of come up later also when we look at some of these kind of works, which is that I was showing them the Brecht scenography, the staging, design, etc. And people would gape as if they are seeing, you know, kind of opulent Taj Mahal, and then kind of think of their own situations as not, you know, kind of economically not that high. But he would say, therefore, what we need, people are desiring is not necessarily, and that's not the model of giving these sort of big sets and stagings, etc., but an elementary quality of Brecht, and people are kind of desiring for that, and that could become a connection to kind of think of larger kind of relations with West Germany. And it's interesting that West Germany also then picks up Brecht as the central point to kind of start intervening, and this is probably one of the first kind of interventions by the Goethe, or what is called Max Muller Bhavan. And you can see over the history, from whether it's Max Muller Bhavan in Calcutta to Max Muller Bhavan in Delhi, you can see over the years of what they have facilitated or tried to kind of do, whether it's bringing, you know, writers, theatre practitioners, and other filmmakers and other kind of interactions made possible. So this is also the kind of, so this is have very deep kind of histories of, or they are deep rooted histories of Cold War. And this is a very conscious kind of India as a peculiar space where certain kind of engagements have to be done. And Brecht become, ironically for West Germany, also the space to kind of do. And then they kind of really think of Heimer as a figure, because he's a very very important director, but regarded as a political theatre, who has engaged with Brecht very strongly, but also to the point of doing certain Brechts, so that he's banned from doing Brecht by the Brecht Foundation. So it's a peculiar figure who who engages but comes to, so he comes to Delhi with certain kind of plans, but that does not materialize. He has certain lectures there, but then quickly decides that next year what he would plan to do is certain, is this production, that Antigone as placed within Calcutta. Now you will see Paul Chalish, Wolf Munzer as a designer, Alok Ranjan Das Gupta's translation. There is a lot of work on that, very important translation of the Greek text into Bengali, and Subrata Roy Chaudhary, who is actually a very important renowned Hindustani musician, who's sort of popular in Germany, quite very well known in Germany. And so this is sort of really the space from which they are coming, is where they are. Okay. 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 So, so this is sort of like a lot of these sort of collaborations. The people who are coming together are people who are quite well known in Germany, or in the space from which the kind of productions are designed. There's a lot of discussions at that point that is sort of emerging. And to kind of really come to the specificities of production, and one of the most important and most kind of debated and interesting thing about the production was that it is actually not conceived as a proscenium production, but it is done on the grounds of the St. Paul's Church, a very iconic church within the heart of Calcutta. This is done on the grounds of it, and this is probably the first time they are renting it out, and then they start renting it out for marriages, etc. But this is something that is done for the production. They find this sort of huge space outside the of the church itself, and what they did with that space, we will kind of come to it a bit later. Now, like I said, Cold War, that is one kind of really important framework to understand what is going on, and that kind of raises certain kind of issues, especially in a space like Calcutta, which is really kind of really stark, and a period that we might not necessarily can imagine from at this point, that it's an absolute stark division of certain kind of political divisions. So, a space like Max Muller Bhavan is a space that some people who would be on the left, or who would kind of align with certain kind of work with GDR would never have entered in their life, and they would never enter. So it is a stark sort of political divisions, because here is a director coming from West Germany, therefore is coming with certain kind of projects of of the Cold War, and we are not therefore going to engage at all. Now, that's a very interesting and very complex space to kind of imagine from the position that we are in present, when unipolar world, or certain other models of thinking about the world. But more than that, it also kind of really is a space to kind of this sort of crisis, and a lot of controversies around it is because of this stark political situation. So, if Utpaldat is saying that there is a third space of looking at it, which is the audience, which is the final way to kind of really understand what is going on between the character, actor, etc. In a certain sense, these sort of exchanges may be the test, or what is done in the production or not in the production. Kind of, it's not simply about have they represented something correct or not correct, authenticity, rather than those debates, what it kind of produces within the larger public sphere in terms of its impact, its effects, ripple effects even, is actually far more, and those are kind of ridden with contradictions, and those will be something that will really need to parse out, and that is where actually we can see what theatre does in certain ways. So, one of the most important points, of course, was about the production that became controversial was, of course, the funding, because this was a really not necessarily large funding, considering in terms of Jaime's own kind of theatre production, what he does in Germany, but within the Indian context, this is a really high kind of funding that is given, and it kind of really making an argument that an actor would be paid even for the duration of the rehearsals, right, and kind of paid 3,000 per month, which is quite a kind of amount at that point, which is sort of a certain kind of push for professionalization of theatre, which is not in this, in that condition, it is not there. It's in a space of amateur theatre, you are kind of really doing something really of that scale. They would audition, therefore, and to find around 40, it's a big ensemble cast, around 40 actors, so they will finally find 32 actors. But because of even the first stage of sort of political kind of divisions, lot of mainstream actors or people part of the groups are not applying. They do not want to kind of associate with the project at all. So, what they end up is actually a far more younger or even amateur cast who have not otherwise done too much work. So, it's very interesting. So, that kind of it's certain kind of limitation, even though you have so much funding and so much certain things to do, but that space does not allow you actually give you to the actors in certain ways that might actually be quite more kind of malleable, but they would work with it, and kind of it raises other tensions there, which is kind of interesting. Now, I'll just sort of leave that there, and then we'll come back to certain parts of what is this? I think something is happening with I think there is some, okay. Do you have a pen drive? Do you have a pen drive, for instance? I don't know, my computer is.
My presentation.
just
You empty the
bin.
dustbin and then sort of
I don't know what is suddenly it sort of started saying this. It's just, I think, maybe it's something about installation or some nonsense. But
If you have the PPT, you can simply convert it into a PDF and then show it. Program. Folder.
ask them to open the airdrop.
Yeah, it's open.
PDF, it will play like a PPT.
Politics, money, funding, that is kind of the really, we'll come back to some of the questions of Cold War later. Now, but most importantly, for us also, I think what's important is also to look at the question of Antigone in Calcutta. Why do somebody wants to do, how do you contextualize, what is that also kind of give us certain kind of political possibilities, and that is something that is quite important in terms of this production. Now, this is for instance Jaime saying the possibility to realize Greek theatre in a Shamiana on mud in a way far off from any fixed civilizational norms. This is not just an effort to escape which interests me in the project, new experience I would like to undergo, but above all possibility to realize Greek material closer to its origins. Now, that is very interesting, closer to its origins. It implies like hardly like any other drama of three great classicists, the possibility to search for common sources of European and Indian culture and civilization. Now, this is something kind of really kind of larger framework of interculturalism. These becomes very important and interesting, and why this sort of certain questions are coming up. One is this sort of desire for common sources of European and Indian civilization, and Antigone becomes a very interesting text, and Calcutta becomes a site to kind of really do this kind of search, or site becomes a place where you can kind of supposedly stage this. And this sort of idea of closer to Greek origins, why and what does that do? Now, on one is this problem of therefore myth, and as I will say, either the problem of historicization, but a historicization, what could the historicization be in theatre be or look like in certain ways. Now, what he is kind of looking at, and it is also the period of 70s. Now, Jaime has done Antigone before also in Cologne, twice he has done Antigone. So, it is not that he is just picking up Antigone only for Calcutta, he has already done it twice. Now, his also work, like he sort of really invested in some of the very important theoretical propositions on the Greek mythology and ways to historicize Greek mythology, kind of which was sort of important at that point. One is of course the work of some George Thomson, Robert Graves, Ernst Bloch, and of course very importantly Johann Jakob Bachofen, whose Das Mutterrecht, mother right, that is kind of really the important one. Now, which kind of says that there is something about the myths, at the heart of the myths, which is about the real, that it is not something that is fantastical, it is not something that is just imaginative, but it is actually something really condensing the real. So, he would say for instance, Bachofen for instance had the position that the assimilated memory of something historical real, and that is what the myths and definitely Athenian society, and therefore Athenian society could be seen as the highest expression of paternal principle that was arrived to a great extent by an overcoming of an earlier matriarchal culture. So, this was a position that was kind of really very, very strong. So, there is something about Antigone, for instance, what Antigone represents, which is a certain kind of fight between not just two individuals of Antigone versus Creon, but two kinds of not just principles, but in terms of two possibly legal systems. And that is so, and that it is not in the simply in the level of abstraction, but the argument at least in these sort of position that it is actually a historical event of transformation from a matriarchy to patriarchy, that is sort of condensed by a myth, right, whenever that event was, and that myth is sort of revealing or giving us in certain ways kind of. So, for Jaime, it is a matriarchal demand realized in its extreme and would promise no progress either. So, it is certain kind of a Creon on one side, a patriarchal principle, Antigone, it is a change of one legal system into another, but in that change necessarily, so it is two counter forces, but that forces is part of forces of history, and yet it is not necessarily that even that what Creon's move or the movement of towards patriarchy would be for Jaime and for others like even Bloch and others. It is certain kind of development without progress. It is sort of moving from certain things to complete a certain form of development of the state, etc., but without what they call progress. And the Antigone position also for them is in certain sense, it is not necessarily something that is actually realized in its extreme, also would not necessarily promise a certain kind of progress. Now, this is sort of the space in which things are happening, and what he sort of conceptualizes this world of looking for origin or looking for commonalities or sort of European and Indian civilization. What it is, or at least what he attempts to do, is to kind of bring that under this new space, which is kind of crucial, which is outside the cathedral, but basically digging up the whole place and kind of converting that under a huge kind of shamiana, a tent, and creating a space for theatre in this sort of really earthy kind of way, right. So, you will see the acting space is divided between, on one hand, on one kind of corner is Creon's fortress, where on the ruler's mountain rises a bamboo construction crowned with cow, steer skulls, plastered with mud, and distinct a place of the dead, which is sort of ditch filled with water between them, 3 holes in the mud, which we will see in the photograph soon. In the mud at the center, used by Antigone and Ismene, from which they crawl out and crawl back, simple clothes, etc., and building a linkage between Antigone and Ismene as kind of earth. So, there is a mountain of bones, skeletons for the Tiresias is kind of one. There are vultures on stage, actual vultures who are live vultures, who are 3 of them who are under the Tiresias sort of graveyard. Candles, lighting certain ways, cow, which kind of becomes an important kind of figure within the production, etc. Now, so what it sort of, in a certain way, it sort of produces. So, you creating, you are digging up, and they kind of, we will see that they bring mud, kind of 280 lorries of mud is sort of brought in and sort of created this space, which is sort of creating this sort of almost kind of what a landscape of death that you kind of move into, right. Now, what, on one hand, what is this? We saw Hamlet machine and other things, like really breaking the structures using technology, bodies are kind of really fragmented, all lot of that sort of work that Jaime does. But he comes here and then, you know, picks up on another kind of problematic, and like Peter Marx, who has written about this sort of moment and his move, that there is one of the things that is even within Germany that is being stressed or within is felt, is this sort of limitations of the national discourse and the need to kind of really, you know, directors moving into a global concern, and Jaime being a particular crucial example because of lot of things, including the oil crisis, lot of you know, events that are happening around it, which kind of gives a sense of an ecological disaster, that an impeding ecological disaster is sort of really there, and that is where you are kind of really imagining a space of Antigone myth within this sort of world of the, you know, to kind of narrate the global kind of condition, right. And you will see and another, but unlike some of the interculturalists that we will see from maybe tomorrow and somebody like Peter Brook, etc., this is clearly within a political theatre tradition, and you know, from Piscator onwards, that tradition, even if it's from West Germany, etc. One of the things that we kind of really important here is kind of what is the Calcutta that they are encountering, or what is the larger, you know, if there is an India that you are encountering. Yesterday also we had questions of what is this India or not India, right? That is the kind of a question that seems to be the intercultural question. But here what we are encountering, so it's double part. On one hand, it is not an India in this cultural terms that is the issue. It is not Calcutta, which is, you know, as a cultural or a certain kind of identity that is the issue. It is Calcutta or India as a space within capitalist or within a certain kind of global history in that particular movement. That is what is at stake, even for somebody like Jaime. So, why Antigone and Sophocles in Calcutta? Western scientific progress is responsible for a hell like Calcutta, and that's exactly his words, right? It is a hell like Calcutta is actually produced by Western scientific discourse, right? In contrast to this stands postulate of an original nature inside of Antigone, a matriarchal demand connected with an early cult, which realized in extreme would promise, like you said, no progress either. In Calcutta, we have in front of our eyes everyday chaos, which, if not radically attacked, threatens to explode at every moment. So, it is a particular kind of definition or particular kind of experience and imagination of a continuum of geographical spaces, right, linked to a certain kind of conditions of so his descriptions, I am not going, there is a long kind of his sort of descriptions of Calcutta, what he is seeing. Of course, there is mud, there is you know, sweat, smell, all of that, and kind of really I am picking up certain things which he kind of really graphically writes of a space of dying, utopia less refuge, of fear, distress, disgusting, uniquely cruel, as concrete, as real as no nightmare in Europe could ever have dreamed of, and as I have never seen before in any site in Turkey, Bolivia, Peru, Guatemala, or anywhere else, even in World War II, the Second German War, as it is called around the world. Right. So, this is a space that is being encountered and imagined with all, he's engaging with people, interacting with people, loving what is going on, the life, etc., but also very clearly kind of placing it in within a larger kind of capitalist system to kind of say this is what it is. It is a hell, it is a house of dead, it is a, almost like a slaughterhouse. It is a slaughterhouse, but which is sort of produced by the system itself. And how does he sort of, therefore, the question of Antigone is not, when he is saying it going back to origin, commonalities of European and Indian civilization, what is at stake is also this sort of doubling, right. On one hand, this is about going back to the past, myth, etc., historic, in terms of going back to the past. On the other hand, Calcutta is so real. Calcutta is so real in terms of its poverty, in terms of what it does. So, in a sense, what is the historicization? So, one would see historicization, that is also a strategy he does, and lot of other theatre makers would now kind of probably pick up on political theatre, is the question, is how you do historicization through possibly a strategy of anachronism. That you go, it is not to create a period, it is not to create a perfect world of Antigone where things are authentic, you are transported into a world of mythic Greece, but it is precisely with anachronism that you actually produce this kind of really complex spaces. And I will just go through some of the therefore certain kind of anachronism to set up. So, on one hand you can see that earlier kind of he's, like I said, he has done Antigone before, say for instance the Cologne production before this, which was like, which was the space was actually a very kind of created like a space of a cave. You look at the photographs, you have kind of full armor, actors are in full armor, very heavy kind of it's almost like a claustrophobic space, very small, congested, but claustrophobic space that is there. And here creating a Shamiana tent which is so open with kind of really spaces between. So, that is a contrast that he is sort of bringing up. And it starts with, of course, very slightly again anachronistic, a certain kind of start with the chorus singing out the Brecht's poem of Antigone, but he is not doing a Brechtian Antigone, right. But a poem, Brecht's poem Antigone is sort of first sung out, and that reference is already put up and then kind of moves on, right. So, creating a certain kind of, we could see some of the production, this is rehearsals of work, but some of the spaces that you will see, like I said, there are 3 mud holes in which people, Antigone and Ismail are coming out, they kind of come out in the start of the production from the earth, the hole in certain sense, kind of dark hole of certain kind of, and kind of go back to earth in that way. Chorus, physical acting, those are things that he would start concentrating, because it is a huge space that is being constructed and kind of really working with. And lot of discussions after that would be also, because these are really, like I said, they did not get the actors that they possibly would have otherwise got. So, these are really fresh actors, very amateur, very inexperienced actors, particularly therefore they would select 2 really young people to play Antigone and Ismail, more malleable, and who become quite important actors in their own rights, but sort of working with them. So, lot of comments on acting is not to the level, but it is all physical acting, etc., that they are kind of working with. And the second part of it, certain kind of anachronism, that what it does is that it also is, this is a space where you kind of where you pass through this and then you get into the tent, which have photographs kind of displayed. So, you can see that Hamlet machine, which I kind of that I kind of showed in the right at the start, is also placed there. Because he came like 15 days late, because Hamlet, that production, itself was very controversial. The actor after who was playing Hamlet sort of collapsed, and because he could not carry on performing that. So, Jaime himself performed that role to kind of complete the production schedule. Then he came late. So, all of that is up in the air, the news is there. So, it is also there as a Hamlet is sort of. But what we are seeing otherwise, which is not clear in this photograph, are images from Vietnam War, right. So, you see a lot of, and we know lot of images that very kind of trigger warning, these are quite violent images which were quite out there in the world, La Palme, the bombings, all of that. Now, it has a set of these sort of, which is sort of, you really walk through a foyer which has all these images, and also in the, even in the production in the graveyard, Tiresias's that graveyard also, you will in the background there are these photographs. So, actually the audience would see within the graveyard there is some, behind that is actually Vietnam photographs. So, it's, and yet it's not part of the script, it's not part of the text, nothing, but it is just certain things that kind of really frame positions for you. Right. Another kind of really more humorous one, but I think it's actually very interesting because it goes to the heart of the theatre, which is its materiality, which is something that is, which look at the scale of it, you know, you dug up the whole place and you're creating this whole new space with a kind of a river flowing in between it, because that's how the space is cut. Like, you know, in the midst there is a sort of river. After a point, you know, it becomes a river of blood, etc. So they needed all this mud. Now, where do you get all this mud to create certain things? So 280 trucks of mud was brought in from the metro site, which is just started construction. The new metro, the first time Calcutta is having a metro, so it's kind of brought from there. Now, that is very interesting, and this is kind of news again, kind of audience knows this, etc. So, even in my interviews or things that I measured, a very strong critique of it was that, say, Shamik Bandyopadhyay, for instance, would make a very strong critique that this just does not work, because this mud is from the metro. This mud is being taken from the metro, which is a certain kind of sign of progress or a sign of, you know, really kind of affirmatory things that are happening, and therefore, the landscape of death does not work. Now, this is very strange, but these are kind of really strong positions, and we can see what does theatre do with materials and what does sort of meaning makings happen precisely. And I would say, if that is the argument, then for instance, for productions like this or even a Piscator tradition, precisely because of that doubling of it, that, you know, that is precisely something that would be used for a development, would be used for, or something that is regarded as a point of progress would definitely something that would be used for the making it the landscape of death itself. And that's sort of really something that is sort of very important. So that to kind of really create a certain kind of productive anachronism that would really ground it, so that your audience is always in certain kind of ambivalence of what is that you are seeing in certain ways. And it's also kind of linked to larger sort of questions about. Therefore, I'm harping on this anachronism because this is very important, and this tradition is kind of important because you can see possibly was not the tradition at that point, definitely in the Indian context of political theatre, but probably even now possibly I think one can see a lot more, even though genealogy to this production is not at all there, but you can see ripples, or you can see what is happening now in terms of the large scale theatre productions and the ones that are trying to do political, you know, kind of questions, raise political questions within them, might be doing certain things which are closer to that. You kind of create certain spaces for contemplation, certain kind of ways in which it sort of the space, the ways in which material kind of allows certain far more complex contemplations. And of course, the Vietnam War question is also ridden in contradiction, right? Because it is Jaime's position that, you know, you create a certain kind of frame of a tragedy, right? That Vietnam War is a tragedy for humanity. It is a tragedy for humanity, or it's a tragedy, it's the ultimate tragedy that is going on. And that is a frame, and that is a frame for this tragedy of Antigone to kind of then think where it is going. So, it gives you a very, very different sensibility to protest, to Vietnam War, for instance. You know, you have a director having a perspective of Antigone's narrative without necessarily saying Antigone's kind of rise is a rise of kind of oppressed in certain ways, because he is sort of saying that this is a tragedy in which sort of tragedy for humanity itself is something that also is a very, very strong Western, in a certain sense it's a Western position per se, right? And that is something that will be taken up, because Vietnam would become really the heart of anti-colonial imagination, anti-colonial resistance. So, this kind of tragedy, and you will see a lot of Western press when you look at Vietnam, it will say it's always a tragedy. Why is it? Because Americans went there and kind of really lost the plot, right? So, it becomes actually a tragedy for the West. So, there are kind of all of these are written in these sort of, it is a theatre production or a kind of site a nodal point that kind of really brings out all of these complexities which are there. And I kind of end with that sort of kind of anachronism. So, on one sense, so I would say that this is possibly very interesting. A way to kind of see is that this is what we see as a kind of staging of what nowadays we call capitalocene, that it is capitalism, what capitalism produces in terms of really the extremes of it, of collapse of ecological to all kinds of relations. So, it is a kind of really complex space of staging of capitalocene. But the irony of it is, and that is a question that we should keep asking, how does theatre stage capitalocene? That, you know, if you stage the capitalocene, then when you have the mud from metro, you have done it, where does the mud go back to? Does it go back to the same metro site or same dump yard, or the smaller question, but a very important one, the animals, etc., which is used in there. Actually, they got these vultures who were binded, so people got very offended that you need these actual animals there, but he wanted to create the whole kind of feel. So, there was a cow, you know, which is sort of part of the scene, and Jaime was very, very particularly concerned about the cow and kind of took a liking to the cow and asking what will happen to the cow after the production. And then the production manager said, probably slaughterhouse, where else will the cow go? Cow might go to the slaughterhouse. Now, but that's interesting, that's a crisis, but that's exactly the crisis of a theatre of that scale, of certain kind of political theatre that we want to think about, that we stage capitalocene, we reflect and contemplate, and then also what happens after that. So, how do we kind of negotiate these tensions is also something inbuilt into the theatric questions of materiality of theatre. So, I stop there and I thank you so much. Any quick questions, or what is the time like? 6 o'clock, we have half an hour, but anyway, yeah. Are there any other questions in the back or in the side? Let's give a minute for. No? Is also
If two questions actually. One is that this is a sort of post-colonial exercise in, not post-colonial exercise, but receiving of this imagined geography, in that, if one borrows that term, there's this imagined geography that is being put on this space. Who is it being imagined for? Because the place where it is being done is actually the one. I mean, they know the truth. They don't need this like this realization of what capitalism does is probably something that the countries that need to know, and where the waste goes, and the dystopia that he wants to imagine, while created very beautifully, it has its own biases, but also it's being, whom is it being imagined for, this dystopia? Because this has a very clear binary of the sort of the progress and then the dystopia. So my question was, the idea of imagined geography in a post-colonial context, and then whom is this dystopia being sort of imagined for, with its vultures and the cow?
Yeah, no, the two parts, I wouldn't fully agree with you. I wouldn't fully agree with you in the sense that then you don't need any political theatre in India, no? We know, everybody knows capitalism is bad, or everybody knows, you know, all kinds of oppressions are bad, then you don't need political theatre. Then we have moved into some epic age, I suppose, very golden age. But that's exactly what political theatre does is, the questions of capitalocene, questions of critique of capitalism, these are all, you know, these are for all places in different ways, and it might have been localized differently, etc. But India is also a space at all points to be discussing those, and has to be staged. So this is absolutely staged for the quote unquote people in Calcutta, for nobody else. This runs whatever days that it kind of 5 weeks it is sort of put on. It is houseful. It runs also in practical terms. It does run houseful. People are attracted to kind of this sort of, you know, stagings, etc. But it is really for the space itself. But it is and I have no issues also. I would not critique, because it's a very valid critique. It is a valid critique. It's a valid critique in terms to imagine also, even in a post-independence India, it's an important kind of political, even that framework of tragedy, even a framework of really that sort of dystopia is also actually quite important. I think political theatre could have space for that also. Now the other part of it, which is there in terms of maybe even the Fritz or even others, even you might have an international spirit or you might have other modes to come, but these are also points when other kind of vectors become important. Other points of vectors are important, and that is where a lot of negotiation, and that part I didn't kind of go into we know all about the questions of cow, we have acting, all of these are also kind of really recorded as debates and discussions between actors. He did not know, of course, Bengali, so they're working with translators. So every day they are kind of discussing what is the staging, and you have lots of records of actors saying and kind of making strong position on this is what we don't like, does not work in India, this is not to our meaning, some of it which is incorporated into production, some of which is rejected by him, but he would still stage the cow, that I still want the cow. Now one could have certain kind of positions on, this is not, and yet I would say, kind of I think that question kind of suddenly kind of making, because that's I think is an intercultural framing problem, that we know everything, or we know what is authentic, we know what is our space, and this person has come from outside. I don't think that's the lens to kind of look at, but but contacts create certain kind of contradictions. It also allows certain kind of new things which cannot be named, or things which cannot be also possible. Things cannot be captured so easily might also be possible in those spaces of contradictions. So that's my, at least. Yeah.
No, it's okay, you can go.
My question is rather a extension of what Nisha's asking, but what was India's take in this kind of a cultural exchange? For example, this particular production that you're talking about, here is a director of a certain, position that they hold within the theatre making scene in the world order, but then to come to India and make a work with, say, like you say, like amateur artists. What was India's take in these kinds of cultural exchange? What is it that, what was happening in using such bodies or such kind of theatre making, wherein India's proposition was in the larger sort of discourse of critique of the capitalist model?
No, India's space in two ways, I would say. One is that India is really a center of Cold War politics. And culture became, in 70s and 80s, it became the site through which that is done. Because India is in the third world now, a lot of these sort of internationalism that is there. Therefore, there is a clear kind of investment of India as a space from both worlds in certain ways. So this is kind of, these are kind of start of these processes where things are happening, and this would go on, and this would sort of, they would not actually, and they would, rather than kind of, when they tried professionalization, they would leave that model out. They would say that's not the workable model, but they will move to other ways, and then Gunter Grass and others, a lot of others who will come, and Max Mullerbaum makes this becomes actually a very, very strong template for them to do, even though they could not kind of
Sustain.
or they didn't want at that scale. Even actually they had promise of maybe taking this to villages. He wanted to take it, and it would have been interesting how he would have kind of completely transformed to take something like this into villages, but he wanted to do it, but that didn't work out. So there is some kind of ripple effect definitely for Max Muller. They're kind of thinking, and then it becomes something that they keep doing, and we know how Max Muller is such a big kind of cultural kind of nodal center for a lot of work. Right, so that is important in terms of and India is really crucial because of its place within the larger politics within the developing countries, and you will see these are isolated ones, but you will quickly see people like what we see the foundation, kind of really performance studies, Eugenio Barber, Schechner, all of them are coming via, in the whole discourse of interculturalism is a discourse under Cold War, only that you don't say what it is, right? It has been produced under Cold War. All of them are coming under conditions of Cold War and coming from actually the Western kind of context also. So there is very clearly this is right. IFA will come, Ford, Ford now IFA, Ford will come in with very, very strong kind of investment in certain kind of. So this is a period when all of this churning is sort of happening. So neither am I say Cold War, therefore money is from there, therefore you can write off. But I think that we need to understand where certain things are emerging from. The theatre of the roots, a lot of those sort of linkages are there. At least propositions, funding patterns are changing. Yeah, thank you.
I also sort of would like to follow up, and I would like to connect it to a term that Vishnupriya has slipped in her argument a little bit in passing, but I think it's interesting. And you spoke about the positive tragedy, or the tragedy with a positive perspective, and that is a huge question. For example, within the GDR, that they tried to develop a political doctrine that political theater should be positive to a certain extent and should show something where things develop to. And I think what I find interesting, I would ask you to expand a little bit on that, to what extent Heimer sort of rather aims at a deeper level of the concept of tragedy that has to do with mourning. So in the sense of acknowledging a reality, also the reality that is a crisis, in rather an affective response than sort of in outlining something that would be a positive perspective. Is that something sort of you would see in Heimer's work on tragedy?
Yeah. I think so. In a sense that this is a frame. I wouldn't say cynicism, but mourning is a better word. In a sense, it's not cynicism, but this is about tragedy at a global humanity, tragedy of humanity, and Calcutta becomes the site to see it. You can't see it any other place, or for him, this is the place which we have to see to kind of actually then think about the world itself. So that is why you don't see too much of, there is nothing of, the set is landscape of death. So it's not Calcutta, it is not India. There is music, they are using certain kind of music, they are working with actors, sort of Hindustani music, they are doing certain things with it, but not in terms of, and some kind of, dressing, but not in terms of showing India, because it does not have to be placed, because this is Antigone myth, this is somewhere else, but it could become kind of a larger question of, and so Vietnam War is very clearly that kind of Vietnam War already kind of is kind of all that bombings have happened, things are changing, and now what you do? Is it a heroic kind of, that would be the anti-colonial kind of perspective, that this is heroic, this is something that has defeated the US. That would be one position, but one would be to kind of see the whole thing as a tragedy, right? So I think that is different kind of, and then you mourn for it, which would be, I think so. Because this is a tragedy where everybody dies, and Antigone, it's like so many people are dying, including Creon at the end, right? So it's sort of really on and on.
When you say the GDR was doing it, when it was, are you meaning GDR was doing it in the GDR? Or when they are sort of doing these cultural exchanges?
No. Only within the GDR. Sort of there was quite a considerable discussion in the 1950s and 60s when the politicians tried to set up a framework, to establish a new culture within the GDR. So the idea was to that every play should have a positive perspective. Walter Ulbricht at one point sort of coined this interesting phrase saying, "We will write Faust Part 3." So this will have a positive ending, and I think here and this has been so powerful, at least in the German discourse about political theater. This is how I compared it. I did not refer to the Indian.
There was also the debate, but it was a bit different in the sense that, when it, I don't know how to sort of place it, because there were plays which were sort of about the coal miners, right? And the last scene is when the coal miners are actually drowning in an accident, and where the industrialists, and this was a real incident. And later Utpal said that this is not the way I would have ended the play, because it shows the workers dying. And then there was, these sort of historical plays which were coming in. And as you know, Rustam Barucha's first book, The Rehearsals of a Revolution, sort of said that, by changing the end and ending in that sort of a positive way, because when you're showing these anti-colonial movements, a lot of them, of course, ended in a failure because the British sort of consolidated the power. So there was that whole, and he said that's a distortion of history. And then the reference would always come back to Battleship Potemkin, that Aurora doesn't, but actually they lose. Similarly, in the play about the naval mutiny, Khaibar, which is the ship they did do the whole revolt in, it stands out till the end. It doesn't surrender. The sailors don't surrender. And I think Rustam's critique also sort of came from that, of course the naval mutiny failed. And then the argument is, and then Brecht again becomes an important reference point. But that's what, the whole, it's a very important political theatre debate, right?
Yeah. But I think what is so interesting, this is, how I sort of thought your line is that obviously in the 1970s and 80s something is shifting in the concept of political theatre, in the sense that it is less interventionist in terms of providing a solution or a perspective, but rather acknowledging a specific kind of reality, at least in the German context, I would say.
Particularly in Calcutta, I would say it was the 1980s, 70s. Really, the agonism transformed into antagonism because of the emergency, the political insurgent movement around Nakhchivari. It's after the left comes to power, and I also don't believe that political theatre came to an end because, now you can't be so anti-establishment as you were before. But then those historical repertoire started coming in, so it changed its course.
And even here in the debates one of the debates between actors and Heimer is on Antigone, what happens, and they would say actors would make a position that after emergency, this is just after emergency, we can't show resigned Antigone, we can't show an Antigone who's going to death with, that there needs to be something. But that you can see that there is a real tension on this interpretation has to be more positive, more kind of interventionist. But I guess that Heimer doesn't kind of, at least they finally don't kind of go that direction. But that is there. So you can see within the group or within even the actors, that is kind of the feeling that we want more kind of, what do we do with Antigone, who's sort of,
I have a question to you. You asked your question. Okay. And
16.
that is this, the way you're describing the scenography and, the way the actors were sort of submerged in this mud and the water and stuff. I was just sort of thinking of, that sort of stoic gesture of protest. And Antigone is the example which Jenny Hughes and Simon Parry uses in that, the contemporary theatre review about the gestures of protest. So it's really not Antigone, but Ismail who, stands there and protest. So here, does the scenography build into that?
I wouldn't be able to. But there is that, the relationship.
Sudeshna said, how difficult it
is. In a sense, to do it was difficult because it's also earth dressing in terms of even costume. They would kind of be wiped up. They are like earth itself, so their whole bodies are kind of with clay, etc. And there's also very intimate. I don't know how to, because the text is there, but there's also seems to be a very slightly different interpretation of Antigone and Ismene in terms of really they are together, they are in the hole, they're kissing. There seems to be some kind of really sort of so I think that even the older of his productions on his interpretation of Antigone and Ismene are kind of really intense, sort of, they are paired together, almost like a really almost sometimes in certain sense people might feel sexual relations, that sort of really intense kind of, and you can see those images here also. So that is there, and then kind of and then crawling out from the earth and going back to the earth, and so that kind of relation is very strong, I think. But I wouldn't be able to fully say at this point that if that is sort of Ismene is very strong, because that's interesting, because later when For example, in Anuradha's production, I don't think there's even an Ismail. Things have changed. There's something else that she is also playing with, but which is also Max Muller production, but Brechtian Antigone. So that's a very different kind of Antigone, right? Yeah, thank you.
You said something like that this space where they are performing Antigone is sort of artificially created what they wanted, like it is very utopian and created, crafted in some sense. So my question is, why do they choose Calcutta? Like, I didn't understand why they chose Calcutta. If the space is being created, it is being crafted, it can be any other city for that matter. Like, are they seeking any specific certain kind of audience, or is there another reason for that?
Probably I'm not be able to fully in a sense that Calcutta, Delhi they come to in terms of some of it is practicalities. Delhi is a center, Calcutta is of course a center with Max Muller, and so he comes to Delhi. He watches certain things, he does have some interaction in Delhi. But I guess Fritz Benowitz is already in NSD, so there is already something going on. Fritz has also gone to Calcutta. So there seems to be some kind of choices being made in terms of what is practical and what would be more fruitful. And Calcutta is a center, and it is a theatre city. It is if you want to do theatre and make an intervention, probably in that period, Calcutta is the place to go. No, it is a theatre city in that sense. So that, and kind of it for Jaime, then you encounter Calcutta, you can encounter it because it is a city like that, of a significance like that, that you could kind of place in terms of that. So it's not, so he's not staging Calcutta, but he's staging Calcutta in a different way. For him, Calcutta is this sort of, I would call it, it's that point which brings together Capitolocene kind of alive. Because it's the hell that capitalism produces with all the living things. We should quickly go into your.
No, it's okay. We can just discuss three of us together.
Okay.
I did mention Amal, and I'm sure you will take that from now.
Okay. No, we can have some discussion.
This is very informative. Because you're talking about genealogies and sort of how do you disturb genealogies when you see something like a sort of the socialist sort of things coming in, intervening in a theatre making process. And I was thought of using Amal Alana as a case study and the example of how she disturbs all the genealogies. Ideally, she's Ibrahim Al-Qazi's daughter, and she studied in the National School of Drama. She's sort of developing, she's the chair. And this sort of direct, linear sort of, genealogy we look at is so disturbed when she just, goes to the GDR, which is completely different, this sort of methods than what her father had sort of started. She comes back and she does King Lear, and Al-Qazi had done a very important production of King Lear, and NSD curriculum was always production oriented, right? They used to showcase the performance, and then she does Mother Courage, and again just to go with Amal, she does it in Pragati Maidan in a huge, I can't remember, it was I think 60 acres or something like that in the place. So she uses these huge Kathakali costumes. Arjun Raina is sort of performing there with that whole costume swirling. And then it's this frail Manohar Singh, her father's student, one of the big stars who he had created, is Lear. And then she makes a shift to Mother Courage, which is one of her major productions. And again, the way she describes her process, you will see it's so similar to what Anuradha Kapoor is attributing to the Benowitz method. And she worked more closer, both in Weimar and in Delhi with Benowitz. And, in 1A, she says that in Mother Courage, Alana is very clear that she did not want Manohar Singh to impersonate a woman. So she casts Manohar Singh as Mother Courage. I did not want him to take on gender identities through costume or any artificial means, breasts or stomach, but since his own embodied gendered signs and identifying them, particularly an actor coordinated to portraying conventional gendered roles. Amal Alana says that Singh was particularly interested in hand gestures and how women's hands works. So it's the external gesture which would sort of, create this gender fluidity, transform him for this man to the woman. And together with Maya Rao as an invited collaborator, they improvised on scenarios such as courage facing sexual violence, courage pregnant, and exploring relationship between parents and children. Alana recalls that it was a long drawn out process, and many times finding the gender neutrality is to be able to make the transitions was difficult and full of obstacles. The real breakthrough came when Alana asked Singh to speak the way his mother did for Mother Courage, and suddenly, she said, demonstrating women came out naturally. Speaking in his mother's Himachali dialogue, and initially she thought she'll do it in Rajasthan, she shifts it. So like Benowitz, used to tell them, be flexible, break down everything to a few impulses, then reconstruct. Speaking in his mother's Himachali dialect, inflected with local dialect, the male persona ultimately shifted to the female and created the gender fluidity that they were seeking to work on further. This, Alana says, anecdotally made them change the locale of Mother Courage from where they originally intended to locate it in Rajasthan to Himachal, and along with the actor, the spatial milieu changed irrevocably. I wanted to show you a part, but we can skip that. So Manohar Singh's portrayal of Mother Courage and the strategy of masquerade is therefore seen as an important landmark in feminist practice in India. Anuradha Kapoor writes, Amal Alana seeks to make gender mobile, as it were, by disturbing stereotypes. This she does by shifting and restructuring the elements of gender in a production of Himmat Mai, for example, where she reallocated the attributes of femininity and masculinity, passivity, patience, nurturing sympathy on one hand, aggression, courage, bravery, single-mindedness, and authority on the other, from a woman's role to a man's body and vice versa, and thus redefine them. So, I was just trying to also set the stage for Indu tomorrow, that somewhere they're breaking those, natural sort of genealogical inheritance and lineages, which of course theatre history loves. But again, by breaking, there's some sort of genealogical connection they have to remake to make the connect. But it's a far more complicated thing. And, Al-Qazi had a very sort of non-feminist, non-gendered sensibility. And then if you say that, Amal's sort of gender intervention in the gender comes directly from the lineage, it doesn't, right? It's also sort of a break and cuts and where those sort of come and amalgamate together. So that's how it is. So, something to think about. And again, I find it very strange that both she and Anamika Haksar decide to go to Eastern Europe to train. Anamika Haksar goes to Soviet Union. So why? When they could have generally gone to RADA. But it was also important, RADA is the colonial tradition. And if what I was saying that, this whole idea that Shakespeare was the colonial canon, then the earlier generation like Al-Qazi and Utpal Dat was sort of reworking the canon according to a sort of a post-colonial understanding, but they never killed off the author. And if anybody does, it will be Alana, Anuradha Kapoor, Maya Rao, that generation, who will then, deconstruct the canon, kill Shakespeare, and even in a way kill Brecht. So, they would start with things like St. Joan of the Stockyard. Then both Anuradha and Maya Rao would do Brecht's short story, The Job, in a very sort of the dramaturgical intervention which Brecht tells you to do, but adapting to their feminist sensibilities, bringing in the idea of narratives, because it's a short story. So, that's where really iconoclastic denigration happens to the canons, which would include Brechtian texts. But that's the larger picture which I wanted to give.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, so any questions or?
Vishnupriya, go back to a point from your earlier presentation. There was the question about the concept of folk and sort of how Benevitz sort of seemed to have a very different concept of folk than in the Indian context. I would assume, and I apologize because here I'm only aware of the German part of the discussion, but within the GDR, the political doctrine prescribed a specific kind of realism that banned certain theatrical forms. And the only way to get away with other theatrical forms was to claim that they were of a plebeian origin, or that they were part of a specific socialist heritage that one could reclaim. This is how Heiner Müller gets away with the help of Rudolf Münz at a certain point, because sort of Münz says, well, this is a plebeian tradition of folk theater. Do you see in Benevitz's work, sort of looking at his side of the equation, sort of this search for alternative aesthetic forms as well in the encounter with Indian theater, or does he sort of rather come as a missionary, sort of simply entrenched in his own aesthetic discourses?
I think that's what Anuradha Kapoor is implying, that there was this certain conjuncture where in India, the sort of what is the people's art, what is the people's form, was an important concern before, Ford Foundation comes in and appropriates the folk and all that funding and things come. So she's saying that before that there was that exploration into what is a people's art forms, which had suffered a lot because of the colonial sort of marginalization, impoverishment. So the way we today would, not use the term, or we would look at it as a statist project, or, how they would sort of really be reduced to, where the people is not present, it's like an empty signifier of the people and they're sort of celebrating. She's saying at that point in the 60s, there was a potential of looking at it as a folk art form, and where really the people are and things like that. Now she's seeing Benevitz's work with the materiality, and which also becomes their very important thing, as sort of bringing the two sensibilities together, but never saying that Benevitz, did what will later become the theatre of the roots, or took a certain folk form and put it within his performance or the play. He never did that, at least with the NSD productions. And in the early stages, I don't know, later he may have done it in Bhopal and things, or Ninasam. I think Suraj would be able to tell. Did Benevitz adapt folk forms in Ninasam or traditional? Because here, I remember seeing both Caucasian Chalk Circle of Carl Weber's and a Three-Penny Opera. They were Brecht's model book productions. But what his students felt, that there was a lot of liberty in constructing those scenes according to their own sort of improvisation, identities, their own local cultures. If somebody wanted to bring it, fine. But I don't think it was sort of imposed. But maybe Suraj would know more about the Ninasam. Those were his later works, and by the time he may have been more confident to look at folk form.
Actually, Suparna wrote a piece on like his Fritz Benowitz whole like the process. So I think there is a I think I have a question related to this, because if I see the description of what Suparna and even Ninasam has Fritz Benowitz's big photo in its office. First entrance only Fritz Benowitz, then you will go inside. So, but if we see the Suparna's description, it's a very descriptional, like what he does with actors and how he's training, his methods. Finally, he says he's a great like actor training, but whole discussion and description is like more kind of aggressive kind of actor training, and that kind of like in terms of like power structure or how he treats actors, and how in terms of rigor or that Guru Shishya parampara, that kind of in India we do that. But so the whole description is that the physical abuse, physical harm in that sense, and also that mental pressure. So all of that Suparna writes, and at the end of his he writes like all of this guides to the actor training, whatever the narrative is. So of course that traditional imposition is there, means that kind of because even now that genealogy is following, like there are few old NST directors, Sargunandan sir and some other old NST like Akshara sir's batchmates and Anamika sir's batchmates. They are actually trained with Fritz Benowitz, and they are like taking that kind of rigorous kind of training methods. So they are all like now after, means as an actor I feel like yeah it will work well. Means I also at some point in my journey I read that and I am like yeah, this is actor training, we have to train actors like this. But after like thoda sa alien, okay, then if we see then it's a different thing. So now I was thinking while you were talking, I was completely thinking about that only, like when we say like political theater and we are like to achieve something, we whatever the political regime is, like we are like fighting against it, those power hierarchies, and there is a power hierarchy in the theater which is the like director. So then the questions even Amit sir like asked in his last year, like it's both like, so I am in that it's a little complicated.
I think in the actor training institutions that discipline was accepted. And jokes, this is a joke, don't repeat. National School of Drama spoiled brats need it. I think they really needed Al-Qazi and Benowitz to be imposing discipline on them, because they're completely, that's why they did create a generation of good actors for a time and then it died out. But similarly, when Benowitz actually came to work with professional actors, there were really, it was very aggressive, very alienating, and not only with us when he did Himmat Mai, but also when he worked in the GDR. In Weimar, his actors really sort of rebelled. And I would say, I also studied in the Ernst Busch Hochschule, which is the GDR drama school. It is not that, sort of rigid discipline, which RADA is. Because I was 1 year in RADA and then I changed. They are not. They are far more, they talk to you and get it. But Benowitz has never taught in the Ernst Busch. It was Manfred Weckworth and, a lot of other people who were sort of teaching, including even Heine Müller taught for a year's time. But there was no, so I think for actor training method and something which had been set up in the RADA model by Al-Qazi, and he was a disciplinarian himself, I think Benowitz went very well. And what he introduced was, a sort of a different method which had connotations of a socialist ethos. And I think Anuradha only talks about, which I find very interesting, that maybe it's not that ideological Brecht, which somebody like Utpal Dutt and that theatre would adapt, But it was a more ethical Brecht, and that came through Benowitz. When Benowitz brought a sort of a Brechtian strategy, which would allow them later to, sort of work with material, the materiality. And you know how the feminists have elaborately worked with it, Raman, Indu, Meenakshi, they've all sort of worked with it quite a bit. And I think that's the part, as a method, breaking into method, it was the alternative to the Al-Qazi method, which I think was more phenomenological body, the voice, use of the, sort of, it was very Rada, I felt, yeah.
But in Ninasam, I think it's much more complicated because it's a communitarian. Actors are like.
That's what I wanted you to ask.
Was working. It's a actually proper. It's not like school as such. When actually he came, so it's little complicated. I don't know how it worked and all. I don't know, but it's really complicated in that way. Because Subarna has a different method of like teaching, like drama, like it's a discussion, democratic, like okay, you are bringing this kind of different kind of way, because it's come from Lohia and socialist, that kind of way. But this kind of like, and even like Vivekanand is also not like that aggressive in that sense. Vivekanand is also like smooth going and singing mostly, like a different kind of training method. But I don't know like how that community accepted it. And still, there is a photo. It's the big photo of Fritz Benowitz.
I think that's a colonial legacy of the superior race. Because he was a white man, I think they accepted it. About Benowitz.
Any quick questions? Otherwise, we will wind up for today. I think we have overshot the time. Okay, so we are winding up today, but to remind what Peter said at the start, bring your questions for tomorrow. So we'll start with questions. So that let's also, because we're going to deal with a lot of things, and kind of want to get those connections. So get out all of your questions. So first session would be about questions. So that is.